Welcome back! My name is ballerscuba. This is Video Games Over Time. We are still in 1977. Today, we're going to talk about Apple. The story of Apple begins in 1971. That is the year Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were first introduced. Steve Wozniak was working on what were called blue boxes, which allowed someone to make long-distance phone calls at no cost. Steve Jobs was able to sell Wozniak's blue boxes, and a business partnership was born. By 1975, Steve Wozniak had designed a video terminal that could be used to log on to the mini-computers at a local company named Call Computer. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak started attending meetings of the Homebrew Computer Club, a computer hobbyist group in Menlo Park, California. At these meetings, Steve Wozniak got inspired by the microcomputers of the day, such as the Altair 8800, but he could not afford the microcomputer CPUs. Mohs Technology, an American semiconductor company, released their 6502 chip in 1976 for just $20, just under $91 in 2020. That was the spark that Wozniak needed. Wozniak wrote a version of BASIC for the 6502, then started designing a computer for it. It was completed by March 1st, 1976, and Wozniak took it to a meeting of the Homebrew Computer Club, intending to share the schematics of the computer for free. Wozniak also offered the design to Hewlett-Packard, but they turned him down. Steve Jobs saw the commercial potential of the computer and convinced Wozniak to go into business together selling it. So Jobs sold his Volkswagen bus, and Wozniak sold his HP 35 programmable calculator to get the necessary money together. The two of them, along with Ronald Wayne, a chief draftsman at Atari where Steve Jobs was working, founded the Apple Computer Company on April 1st, 1976. This was after Atari had created Breakout, but before it was released. Less than 2 weeks later, Ronald Wayne sold his 10% share in the company back to Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs for $800, over $3,600 in 2020. This was, in retrospect, a bad decision. Wozniak and Jobs then returned to the Homebrew Computer Club with a finished version of the computer, now named the Apple I. There they impressed Paul Terrell, owner of the computer store chain The Byte Shop, who left his card. Jobs went to the Byte Shop the next day and tried to sell Terrell the bare circuit boards. Terrell instead wanted fully assembled machines and was willing to purchase 50 computers for $500 each, over $2,200 in 2020. Jobs then got the parts on credit, and a small crew worked to deliver the order. Steve Jobs returned to the Byte Shop 10 days later with 50 assembled circuit boards. Although Terrell was expecting complete computers with a case, monitor, and keyboard, Terrell paid the money. The Apple I officially went on sale in July 1976 as an assembled circuit board for $666.66, roughly $3,000 in 2020. This number was chosen because Steve Wozniak liked repeating digits, and it represented a 1/3 markup on the $500 wholesale price. The Apple I used a TV for its display, displayed text at 60 characters per second, had a cassette interface for saving and loading programs, and included a bootstrap code on ROM, which made it easier to start. The design of the Apple I was simple, but elegantly done. This computer greatly increased Steve Wozniak's reputation as a designer. Steve Wozniak began working on the successor to the Apple I almost as soon as the Apple I started being sold. Wozniak has stated that his work on Breakout was a big influence on him at this point of his career. Meanwhile, Steve Jobs began looking for investors. Steve Jobs first turned to his former boss, Nolan Bushnell at Atari. Bushnell recommended Don Valentine. Valentine was not interested and recommended Mike Markkula. Mike Markkula was interested and decided to invest in the company. He invested $92,000, over $417,000 in 2020, of his own money into Apple in exchange for a 1/3 stake in Apple, Apple was incorporated on January 3rd, 1977, with the newly founded corporation buying out the previous partnership. The next month, Mike Markkula got the director of manufacturing from National Semiconductor, Michael Scott, to be Apple's first president and CEO. No relation. Steve Wozniak resigned from Hewlett-Packard to work at Apple full-time. Steve Jobs had, by this point, left his job at Atari, which was probably a popular decision at Atari. Within the year, Apple released the follow-up to the Apple I computer, the Apple II. The Apple II was released on June 10th, 1977. The Apple II featured a MOS Technology 6502 processor, 2 game paddles, an audio cassette interface, and a basic interpreter pre-programmed into the machine. Perhaps the biggest improvement was the ability to display color graphics. To show this, Apple changed their logo to reflect the color graphics. The Apple II sold for $1,298 with 4 kilobytes of RAM, over $5,500 in 2020, and up to $2,638 for the maximum of 48 kilobytes of RAM, over $11,000 in 2020. This was cheap enough to make the Apple II affordable for the home consumer as a finished product. This opened up the home computer market further than it had ever been opened before. The Apple II sold $775,000 worth of computers in its first year, and sales were growing. That's over $3.2 million in 2020. Software developers started looking toward making programs at the consumer level. As mentioned before, the computer was released with 2 game paddles. The computer was designed with video games at least as a background thought. Steve Wozniak has said that his work on Breakout greatly influenced the work on Apple II, so it only makes sense that the Apple II works well with video games. As a result, we will be mentioning lots of video games that were programmed for the Apple II. The only video game released for the Apple II in 1977, though, is a version of Breakout. This version was developed by Steve Wozniak and published by Apple. The game was included in the basic interpreter that came with the Apple II, so it has no sales figures of its own. Nevertheless, Apple had poised themselves as a leading company in the home computer market. They had another success on their hands thanks to Steve Wozniak's design and Steve Jobs' salesmanship. This is not the last time that we will talk about Apple, or the last time we will talk about the Apple II. But that is going to do it for the story of Apple so far. My name is ballerscuba. This has been Video Games Over Time. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in our next video where we will be talking about a certain video game console.